All right. Thank you all for sticking around for the last session. We're saving the best for last. We're very honored to have two outside speakers. You've been hearing a lot from us, SHPO staff people. But if everyone could take their seats, I want to introduce Deb Sheals, our next speaker. So during the last presentation, Ethan and Chris talked about a lot of different, it showed a lot of examples, and many of those examples of historic tax credit projects are things that Deb herself was involved in, either writing either writing the tax credit applications or National Register nominations. And in fact, historic preservation consultants can do all kinds of different work. They can be hired to do, to help CLGs with preservation plans, for example, to write historic nominations, to work on surveys, to work on tax credit proposals. And so without further ado, Deb Sheals owns Building Preservation LLC. She's an architectural historian with 30 years of experience in historic preservation, including historic tax credits, historic structures reports, and National Register nominations. She has been involved with over 200 historic tax credit projects in 6 states. And in fact, she has worked with a lot of projects here in Springfield, Joplin, Webb City, Southwest Missouri in general. So we wanted to invite her to speak today, and we're very honored that she is participating.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? So many microphones. All right, well, they asked me to speak a little bit about what was working. There we go. What historic preservation consultants do. And you've heard a lot of that already, but I thought I would go through it. A few of you who don't know the program, your heads may be spinning now trying to figure out what all the ins and outs are. That's why you hire historic preservation consultants. Just like you hire a plumber if something breaks at home, or you hire a CPA to do your taxes. You know, since I've been a consultant, I really appreciate professionals that can spend a lot of time learning that, so that I don't have to spend 50 hours to learn what they can do in 2 hours. And I'm lucky enough to have 3 decades of learning it, but the consultants good consultants know the program. They know the requirements. They keep up on the requirements as they change. I always tell people that essentially the consultant is your liaison between the government and you. We kind of help keep track of everything, explain things to you, explain things to the reviewers, so that we all stay on the same page. I love that Venn diagram, by the way. That's exactly what we should all be doing. Also, everybody's busy. I have a lot of clients that are busy and miss that email or don't realize they're supposed to file this paper or that paper. So that's why you have a consultant, so they can kind of keep track of that. And as I said, we keep up to date on regulations, and I'll talk in a minute about the new legislation that's just got passed, but we'll go through this quickly. You've already heard about other experts. Invaluable. I always tell my clients, don't expect me to get you a building permit, and don't ask your structural engineer to do your historic tax credit projects or applications. We all need to work together. And you've heard about architects, contractors, engineers, CPAs are critical. We haven't heard much about the accounting side of it, but it's very important. And we're going to hear from a banker in a minute. So that's just clarification that, you know, your consultants can give you some general guidance, but you need to know the program and consult with the correct professionals. So National Register, we've heard about it. You do have to have it for the tax credits. They talked about a PDIL. A Part 1 will also help you establish that your building is potentially eligible for the credits. So that's kind of your first step. If it's not listed, consultants will also prepare a register nomination. And then planning the project is very important, as everybody has pounded into us today. And that's working with everybody. Back to that Venn diagram. Everybody needs to be doing that to develop the plan and then stay in contact during the project. Also, consultants will actually help you gather the paperwork. I mean, the list of paperwork, especially for the state program, is a couple of pages long, and it's an online application process. You have to have all those papers together before you do the application. The nice thing about that is the online application, if you're missing major things, they just won't accept it. So there's a little circuit breaker there, but it's a lot of work. And if you don't know it, it's really a lot of work. I think the first time I did the new state program, I think I spent 40 hours on one application that now is maybe 10. It's still a lot of time, but again, you know, you're busy. You don't always have time to learn that on your own. Documenting the project, we talked about. Generally, it's the consultant that does the photos, plans, work with the architects. Tim Rosenberry's here. He worked, one of my first projects in Springfield was with Tim. So often the consultant will work with the architects to get the drawings that are needed and sometimes make markups or suggest that the architects add notes. Another thing that especially the Park Service is asking for a lot these days is not just saying we're going to replace the flooring with X, but an actual product info of the specific flooring or the light fixture. So we can help gather that or help your contractor gather that. Once it's in, and again, both application processes are now digital, which is very nice. But then it gets in, like I, for example, have a database of projects going so that I can kind of keep an eye on if review is due or if something's due. You know, that again becomes the consultant's job, and you can go on with doing all the things that you have to do. Sometimes questions will come up from the reviewers, and they can get that information often from the consultant, or the consultant can reach out to the owner and say, hey, I just need this one little thing, or what we decide on. And sometimes that takes a little back and forth. So that stays on your consultant's desk instead of yours. During construction, the consultant's still involved, or should be. Anybody who's done a historic rehab knows that you get surprises, things come up. I always tell first-time rehabbers, you know, expect to be surprised. It never goes exactly as planned. Sometimes, so your consultant can be your first line. They're the person you can call and go, hey, here's what happened. Is this a big deal? And, you know, I always tell people, you know, you're going to get a yes, no, or a maybe. You know, sometimes I'll just say, no, that's not a big deal. Sometimes it's things that owners think are no big deal at all are a major deal, like, you know, changing window suppliers that can get your project denied. And the maybe is, okay, we've got to go talk to the reviewers and get on the line with them and see if they can help us with that. And then sometimes amendments are needed. And again, that's another thing that the consultant can do to get that turned around. And the staff is very good about working back and forth, especially with amendments, so we're sure that we're getting what they want, so we can keep that review going. You've heard this, but I'm going to say it again and again because you can't say it too often. Make sure the project matches what was submitted. That's the owner's responsibility. In the end, unless you're going to pay the consultant to be on site a lot, it's up to the owner to make sure what was submitted matches what was done. I always say it's your contract with the government. This is the scope of work, what we put in. So it's critical that we don't go all this work to plan the project and then do something else. I put pay review fees in here, 1, just to clarify that there are review fees, and 2, to clarify, as mentioned, that your project will stop if you don't pay that federal review fee. As a consultant, I usually remind owners of that, and then sometimes remind them again, just to make sure it keeps going. Another thing that can get you in trouble at the end is not taking care of your expenses. We've talked a lot about design review, but DED tracks expenses very closely. And then you need to hire a CPA to review those expenses and do a cost certification. You got to start from the beginning. You got to get your CPA on board early and make sure you're tracking the expenses. And I mean, every invoice, every method of payment, don't pay cash. It's as picky as you think, as you can imagine, and maybe a little more. So you don't want to start figuring all that out at the end of the project. You get that done. You get that set up when you start. The SHPO guys talked about this too, but be a good consumer. There are lots of requirements for working for the preservation office, for being a certified historian. There are 0 professional requirements to be a historic preservation consultant. Anybody can hang out a shingle and say, that's what I do. So make sure you're getting somebody who's qualified and who knows what they're doing and is ethical. Get a reference, talk to them, see how knowledgeable they are. It really helps to talk to a couple of people. If you haven't talked to anybody or they haven't been recommended, it's good to talk to somebody they've worked with. Get copies of what was submitted. In this digital age, it's pretty easy to put together a digital packet and you can have that on file. You're going to sign something, and sometimes with digital file signatures now, it's pretty easy, but sometimes you get physical signatures and then it might be 6 weeks before everything gets figured out and you put the application in. So make sure that application got submitted. You should be copied on that. Keep copies of all those approvals and notifications from SHPO and the Park Service. As they noted, they come in emails, and sometimes those are easy to miss. Your consultant should be keeping track of all of those, but as the owner, you also need to do that. If your consultant dies in a car wreck or just wigs out, you need to know what was going on with your project. And there's been a few, really only a few, but I've dealt with some people that had consultants that just never put the application in, which means you don't get your credits at all. Luckily, that's very rare, but there's been several that got in it and got over their heads and just walked away. So be comfortable with who you're working with and trust but verify. Never hurts. A few things of what not to do. I used to have a list like this of, 10 ways to screw up your project, but this seemed a little more positive. Don't start the application too early. If you don't know what you're going to do, you may tie yourself into work you don't plan on. You may not mention work that you end up wanting to do. It may be so vague that your project gets put on hold because SHPO doesn't even know what you're proposing. Don't start too late. If you're ready to start construction tomorrow and you just now get around to talking to a consultant and getting your application in, you're going to be really behind the ball. Right now, it's about 12 weeks before you get your final answer going through SHPO and Park Service on what your project can do. So you need to plan it, you know, and I often tell people this is one of the, probably the biggest, a drawback of the program. There aren't many because I love it, but it slows things down sometimes. So give yourself a little time. And as far as if you start too early, sometimes you don't know that stuff and it's like, oh, well, we'll figure it out later. Well, there's some things you just got to figure out early. You know, often, for example, you might not pick replacement windows. You might think you can keep the windows. Those are the kind of things you have to figure out early so that you're not mid-project and need an answer that's going to take 12 weeks to get, because everybody knows construction projects aren't very flexible for that. Don't order expensive materials before the review process is complete. And like, for example, windows, replacement windows are very, very expensive. I tell my clients never order those until we're sure we have the approval that we want. But you can start work for the state project. Well, the state program will let you start incurring QREs once your application is submitted. So that still means you've got 12 weeks, best case scenario, before you get an answer. But there are things that can be done, and your consultant can help you identify those. For example, if you have a roof that's leaking and it's, you know, a flat roof on a commercial building where it's not even visible, then fix the roof while we're waiting for other things. So you can get some of that help from a consultant with identifying, you know, what's safe to do before you get the full sign off. And as noted, don't fail to read the description of work in your Part 2. And I don't know if we clarified that. It's the application process is the photos, the written description of work, and that is, you know, here's what the finishes look like now. Here's what we're going to do with the finishes. So you get a laundry list of what you're going to do. Sometimes that doesn't get read by anybody but the person who wrote it and the reviewers, and then we get into trouble. So failing to communicate that with your team can get you in big trouble. My best clients make that application part of the plans and specifications for the job. So they know right away. And I love it when I have a client call and go, hey, you said in section 5 that we were going to do this, which means they actually read it and are keeping track of it. A great example of miscommunication, I had a complicated project, had finished soffits put in so they could hide the heating and ventilation up above, put these in, finished the whole thing out, then had the heating and ventilation, the HVAC guys come to install it. They hung the units that were meant to be hidden in the ceiling on the bottom of the finished drywall soffit, because nobody said, here's a lowered ceiling, put it above. And it was timing, it's everything. So that was one of just, I think they were on their 3rd or 4th job superintendent and it just got lost. It was kind of silly, but stuff happens. I've seen contractors cut big holes in brick walls because they're like, well, the way it was on the plans, that didn't make any sense. We're going to do it this way. So that's something to watch. Same thing, don't change your plans without communicating with the consultant, who will then communicate with reviewers if it's something major. And finally, keep good financial records or you'll regret it at the end. So I'm going to show some before and afters because they're really fun and everybody loves that. But I want to give you a little summary of the changes in the new legislation, which is very exciting. And it was officially the Senate substitute of House Bill 2062. That increases the state tax credit to 35% outside of Kansas City and St. Louis, as we've discussed. It adds not-for-profits to eligible applicants. That's done, for example, in Kansas. I mean, the reality of it is that those tax credits get sold anyway. So this allows not-for-profits to meet their needs, sell those credits, get that building back into service. It's going to be a really a boon for a lot of smaller areas. So most of the changes in this bill were done to kind of give a leg up to outstate Missouri. So they looked at things like that. Another kind of special category were schools and theaters. Historic schools and theaters are sometimes tough to reuse. So they've got a little favorable treatment in there as well. The overall caps stay the same. They're right now, we've got three categories. If your project has under 1.1 million in QREs, then you don't count against that cap, which means you don't have to worry about getting those credits allocated right away. If it's above that, everybody gets in line for available funds, and it's $120 million total, which can go quickly for a whole state. And that's 90 million overall, and then there's an extra 30 million for qualified census tracts. Now there's quite a bit of Springfield that's in qualified census tracts, and in other parts of Southwest Missouri. So that kind of gives you a little leg up for that. Used to be you could only apply twice a year for those higher applications. Now you'll be able to apply anytime, year round. And that starts July 1st with changes to DED. So we've had two big changes here. We had DED change their rules, as Elizabeth said this morning, and then we have this legislation. So these are kind of big changes. You can now, well, as soon as the governor signs this, and I'm going to say when, not if, because let's be positive. With that change, you'll be able to apply with the state application. Now, as I mentioned, you can apply for the federal, but you can't even apply for the state credits, and they'll therefore start incurring QREs until the building is listed in the register. And that's about a 9 to 12 month process. So that can significantly delay your project. This is a really big change that aligns it with the federal program. There are also set timelines. Now the SHPO will have 60 days to review it, and then it goes on to the Park Service if it's a dual project. If it's a state only, they have 60 days, and then they have to rule on it. Phasing project was improved. A change I think that's in the rules, not the law, is that rule that you can't incur cost until you put your application in. DED will now allow up to 10% of your QREs to do work before you apply. And that's back to that leaky roof. We argued, and successfully, that the damage from a leaking roof for the 6 months it might take you to plan your project is going to do so much damage that there are things that just have to be done right away. It's still at your risk if you do something that doesn't meet the standards, you can have to reverse it, but that's going to be a big help. There are also timelines on when DED will issue the credits at the end of the project. You know, this program is kind of, you get the credits at the end. So you plan your project, you do the work, you spend your money, and then you get the credits. So we've had some backlogs in the past where people finished their credits and then waited months and months and months to get their tax credits, paying high interest rates on construction loans. So there's now a cap on that, which will make it much more predictable and quicker turnaround. There's also an appeals process that probably will not be used a lot, but if there are decisions that no one can agree on between the applicant and the reviewers, then there's an appeals process for that. So all of those are in SSHB 2062, and it wouldn't hurt to call the governor's office and ask them to sign that bill. It's been there, 7 or 8 days. And the bill, this legislation has been very popular. I think it was like 1 against in the House and pretty close in the Senate, but there are other things in the bills. You just never know. So keep your fingers crossed, encourage action on that. Okay, so let's see some before and afters. This is actually Columbia, Missouri, in their downtown. On the top left is, we had a monstrous heavy concrete canopy on our main street. Springfield had a much lighter weight canopy around the square. I think some people probably remember that. Taking those off revealed the facades and made it possible to get those places listed in the register and therefore eligible for tax credits. I think we've all used this same photo today, but it's a good one. And you are all familiar with the Galois, but as a reminder, the Galois is in the middle with the big sign, and then what was the Netters building is on the left. Those were both rehabbed together to, you know, give some more room for the Galois and get it ready to go. And this was rehabbed in 2003. Here's what we started with. Water. It's always water. Lots of damage. And then here's right after they opened. The beams, they found residue of stenciling and used Evergreen Studios. Conrad Schmidt, sorry, good job. Did you do this one? Was this yours? Well, here, I'll let you narrate. I'll say we're on to another one. This one's funny. You guys recognize this building? I call it paintball. We called it paintball. The historic name is Springfield Furniture. But it was a paintball factory, or a paintball when paintballs first came in. It had been that for years when Craig Wagner bought it and redid it. And here's the after for that. And it looks great. I was just by there. Still looks good. Here's a little paintball residue left on the outside. Broken windows. These windows were restored. He took all the glass out, sandblasted the frames, and put new glass in for the ones that were in place. And there it was, almost finished. Inside had a really interesting paint scheme. And then next, after the walls were not historically painted, and they were able to clean them up and get a mix of commercial spaces and residential inside. Will Hoyt Plaza. And I love this photo because in the background is the old Great Southern Bank, which is now about to become the Moxie Hotel, another historic tax credit project. The Will Hoyt was a big building downtown. It took up a lot of square footage. And it was largely vacant when they started. This was the Matt Miller Company, now Vecino. that did the rehab, and there it is when they finished. Inside, a lot of the ground floor were, garage space and unfinished. And now they're filled with various restaurants. I saw that. Now there's an axe throwing bar. Is that still there? That cracked me up. That's such a combination of uses. I know. It's like, am I seeing that right? I had to walk a little closer to make sure I was reading the sign. And the apartments upstairs, there were offices upstairs that, and like this one including, was in pretty good shape. And they make great apartments. So put a whole lot back in service. This is a great project. This is on the square. It's now the library. I'm sure you guys know that. And this is an example of after taking that canopy off, we could see the buildings, and we were able to add some of the square to the National Register. I think we ended up doing that in 2 parts, kind of as the canopy came down and people got interested in it. I think I counted 7 historic tax credit projects on the square alone. And I was walking around with SHPO reviewers. I think yesterday we were talking in it, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that historic tax credits help transform the commercial areas of Springfield. I mean, I think my first project was 25 years ago, so I've seen it evolve, but it's amazing what's happened. And it's, I think someone earlier said, it's preservation and economic development. Well, they are the same thing. You can't separate those. There are great, angles on both, but historic preservation is economic development. And this is the back of that. This was the old Kresge building originally. And there's the entrance to the lofts after. Inside was a rock and roll bar. Anybody remember the name? Yeah. Here's how old this project is. This is a scan of a hard photo. I didn't even have a digital file of this one. But I guess I did this project over the digital transformation because the after photo is a digital file. And that was just before the library moved in. And Brick City, Springfield Ice and Refrigerator Company. And this was a long project. Tens of millions of dollars, close to downtown, 6 buildings. I think we did historic tax credit projects on. When I first toured it, it was still a working refrigerator plant. And I was terrified I was going to get locked in one of those coolers. There it is from the other end. Most of the buildings were vacant when the project started, and the company moved out, obviously, before we got started. There you can kind of see 1, 2, 3, 4 of those buildings mid-project. This was the first one finished. I noticed just a little while ago, it's got some big new signs on it, but it's in service. Here's what it looked like when we started. And then almost ready to move in. Kept the structure exposed. This is a nice way to get some acoustics in there without ruining the look. I mean, we wouldn't want to put the ceiling in that room. Here's one of the other buildings. They all had numbers, but I've forgotten the numbers. One of the second, I think it's one of the next ones they did. And here it was when it went into service. They kept, they didn't try to make it look too pretty on the front. It was a historic building, but cleaned up the sides and had to paint some of those. And again, really monumental structural systems that stayed and gave the rooms really a great character that you just can't match. There's that building at the end. I feel like they made cheese in this one, but I'm not sure. This one got new windows in. Interior spaces. This had a little higher rooms, probably because it was manufacturing than an art studio. I mean, it's great. And I see the college is still there. This is a good example of even before, not-for-profits couldn't do the rehab. So the developers did the rehab, leased the space to the school. And you can structure the lease so that it's a qualified lease. And then when the 5-year recapture period ended, they could change that. And I think the school bought the property. And holy cow, what an asset. How many square feet did we put downtown back into active use? Here's my last one. We talked a lot about schools today. This is an Ittner school, Bailey School, which we can almost see from this window. I thought this was great because the school system didn't just put this on the market and say, how much can we get for it? They put out RFPs of what will you do with this if you buy it? And Jason Murray, who's done several really good rehabs in town, got it. And here it is today, or a few years ago. This one this is the back wall, and on the left there is a long modern addition that was still part of the project. And so that became part of a courtyard. Now we're kind of looking the other way at that. That modern addition became apartments. He put apartments in there as well. And then the backyard that was the play yard or the recreation yard for the school became a courtyard for the tenants. This is one where actually the photo of the before is actually a little better than the photo after, but we didn't touch that woodwork. It was in great shape. And so he was able to keep all of that and clean it up. Classrooms were open. We've seen that schools, really a classroom's a pretty good size for an apartment. So often when you do a school rehab, you can just keep most of the classroom walls in place. And here it is as an apartment. This is that modern area in the back that also became some pretty cool apartments. They were it had high ceilings, so they were able to put 2-level apartments back there. And then I'm going to end with this. This was the grand opening for the school. These are all, adults are all teachers or spouses of teachers who taught in that school who came back to see it. And I always say, I got into preservation for the buildings and I stayed for the stories. And as Riley said this morning, there was lots of attachments to why we love historic architecture, but that connection to our history is pretty eloquently said here. So, anybody have any questions? Got all the changes to the legislation memorized now?
You said that you have to be careful on if you get a consultant.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to find out if they're good or if they're bad.
The best way is to get recommendations and ask them. Now, and you can also, look on the website, do a little bit. There is a list of consultants on the SHPO website. But that's just kind of, I think all you confirm is if they're in business. They can't even legally recommend people. So look at that. Look at, the most is, get their resume, talk to them, see if how many projects they've done, and then talk to other people. If I was just going cold and nobody had recommended anybody, I'd get a couple of recommendations.
So how do you get those?
Oh, well, if the consultant you're interviewing is not willing to give you references, move on. Yeah, just, like you would a job applicant, just ask them for references. Ask them what they've worked on, maybe look at those projects. Nice thing about Google, even if they work somewhere else, you can, get an idea of if those were actual projects got done.
In response to that, about the SHPO's, the list that's on the SHPO website, those are people whose qualifications we. So if they say they meet the qualifications, the Secretary of the Interior has qualifications, professional qualifications, emission standards. So if they say they are qualified as an architect, we confirmed that they are an architect. If they say they're qualified to be an archaeologist, currently we we update the list as often as people tell us they're out of business. So if they've not told us they're not out of business, then
Yeah. Yeah, you can't help that. Yeah, and historic consulting is kind of a odd mix of history and architecture. As I've figured out trying to find a replacement, you need a little knowledge of both. I've had some really great historians work for me who, couldn't describe a doorknob. And then we all know how architects are. They can't write about history. So, getting that mix and, if you get a firm, and most consultants in Missouri are like I am, small with just, 1 or 2 employees. So that's where it helps to get somebody who has a little time in it, or, and I always tell new clients, okay, I'll be your historic expert, and then either your architect or your contractor should also know historic projects. I can help guide one or the other, or the 2 of us can help guide the one that doesn't, but don't start with everybody that's new to the whole thing. Doing historic rehab is a whole different creature than new construction. And I've found for contractors, a lot of that is just attitude. If, they walk in and go, oh, you can't keep that, tear that out. No, you can't do that. You can't do that. If there's lots of no's and just not like, oh, well, how could we do this? I mean, that's what historic rehab is. How can we do this? One, should we do it? Or will SHPO make us do it? Or I love that, I want to keep that. And then how do we keep that with, I think the question was, dealing with hazardous materials. There's always things that you have to balance. So getting that willingness is a big deal. I mean, you have to be qualified, but for, other craftsmen, you also have to want to do it, or you're just going to fight. You don't want to be fighting your contractor all the way to do the work. All right. Oh, you're going to introduce Nadia?
Thank you. All right. In addition to that information about the Historic Preservation Consultants list, SHPO does maintain a list. The Missouri Preservation also maintains a list on their website, and I don't think it's been mentioned yet, but they maintain lists of consultants and also